everyone, and welcome back to my Archaeologist Guide to Minecraft. Last time, we built a copper mine and a windlass, and today, we have to figure out how to get the copper out of all of this copper ore. In technical terms, we're starting the process of beneficiation. Beneficiation is the process of removing the non-valuable stuff from the ore. So because we're working with copper ore, we're looking for the copper. We're not looking for the other stuff. In a certain sense, the other stuff could be valuable to other people, but it's not valuable to us extracting copper. Think of beneficiation, or like the stuff around the copper in the copper ore. Think of it like weeds. The definition of a weed in a garden is just a plant that's growing somewhere you don't want it to grow. Any plant can be a weed if it's growing in a spot that you don't want it to grow. Just because a lot of plants tend to be considered weeds in like a mowed lawn or something, that doesn't mean that they're weeds everywhere. It just means that they're weeds in the standard for a mowed lawn. We're trying to get rid of the stuff that's around the copper through beneficiation. Beneficiation can also be called mineral processing or mineral dressing or ore dressing, so they're actually like 4 separate terms, which makes this extra confusing. I'm gonna stick with beneficiation just because that's the term that I came across the most, really. But I think mineral processing might be more of like a catch-all term, because that at least was very commonly used in places like Wikipedia, for example. Last episode, I mentioned native copper, which is just pure copper found in the ground. Native copper, because it's just copper, doesn't actually need beneficiation because it's already pure copper. But the other ores like malachite and digenite and enargite and all of those, they're not made of pure copper. They're made of copper plus other stuff. That other stuff, the carbon or the sulfur or the arsenic or the antimony, etc., that all needs to get separated from the copper before we can easily use the copper for things like tools or armor or weapons and such. Those non-copper materials are called the gangue, or sometimes the veinstone, but I've seen gangue more often. Who knew that copper ores were so rebellious they'd become a gang? Okay, alright, I'm sorry, I'll stop. So in Minecraft, this part of the copper ore, the copper parts of the copper ore, those are the valuable bits. All of this stone around it, or all of the deep slate around it, that's the gangue. In Minecraft, mining copper ore with a pick basically does the beneficiation or mineral processing for you. And ironically, I can't actually mine the ore as an ore with my current level of technology. I would need a Silk Touch pick, and that would require at least an anvil to combine, say, an enchanted book with my pick, and even then, anvils require iron. Maybe there's a chance to find a Silk Touch tool somewhere. Maybe there's something with villager trading that I've forgotten, but I'm not gonna spend dozens of hours on the extreme off chance that I successfully trade with a toolsmith villager to get a Silk Touch tool. I also know that I could go find a trail ruin or a woodland mansion with an anvil and use those, but to excavate a trail ruin, you need copper to make the brush, and I can't use copper tools yet. Technically, I could happen upon a trail ruin and hope it has an anvil and just dig the whole thing out with my shovel and ignore all of the archaeological finds. But this is an Archaeologist Guide to Minecraft. It is physically impossible for me to ignore the archaeology, especially in an entire trail ruin. I'm not gonna dig an entire trail ruin for an anvil, guys. I'm not gonna do it. And as far as the woodland mansion goes, you've seen my PvE skills. Woodland mansions are out of the question at the moment. I still don't have leather armor, which I should have done that. But at this point, we're close enough to copper technology that my brain is like, yeah, but why bother? I could use the leather for other stuff, like bundles. Anyway, just because Minecraft streamlines beneficiation for us, that doesn't mean that we can't build the machines and show the industry in Minecraft. So, how do we do beneficiation? As I've said, in Minecraft, we end up with raw copper as soon as we mine the ore with anything other than Silk Touch, and we can just smelt that into copper ingots. And actually, you can also just smelt copper ore into copper ingots. That's not generally the case with copper ores. Technically, you could do that. And some of the beneficiation that we're going to talk about eventually is that. But that's next episode, okay? Next episode's problem. At the moment, as we've said, copper ore doesn't just magically turn into raw copper in the real world. We have to get it out of the rock first. How do we do that? We smash it with a hammer! No, seriously, that is step one, at least at its most basic. Originally, humans got at the copper through something called spalling, which is just a fancy term for smashing the rock open with a hammer. Remember Georgius Agricola from last episode? The guy who is often seen as the founder of geology and mineralogy, who is also super sassy at times, especially about alchemists. He goes into a lot of detail about this step, about spalling, which was still a not uncommon technique in the 16th century. So first, miners would break the large chunks of ore with hammers once it was out of the mine itself. Many of the mines might just leave it at that, but he does also mention that at least at the time in Westphalia, they would take that broken ore, burn it, and then pound the crushed pieces with broad, flat, T-shaped iron tools to break it into even smaller pieces. Now, I don't have access to iron tools, so I'm not going to do that bit, but we're at least going to crush the stone. It would be super cool if the mace in Minecraft would let us smash ores into their raw form. I would actually use a mace if it let us do that, but that functionality isn't in vanilla yet. You can, however, get hammers to smash rocks in mods like FTB Stuff and Things, or Ex Nihilo, or Ex Deorum, or a bunch of mods. There are a lot of mod packs from very early days of Minecraft. Like, there are mod packs, I think, certainly as far as 1.12, there are mod packs with hammers where you can smash things. Editing Archeo here. In terms of Ex Nihilo, or Nihilo, or however people say it, I assume it's pronounced similar to nihilism. The earliest post that I could easily find was one from September 17th, 2013, which is a version of the mod for 1.7. So at least as far back as 1.7, there are hammers in Ex Nihilo for ore processing. So this is something people have been doing in Minecraft for, at least in modded Minecraft, for a really long time. But if you've ever played with those mods, you might find them as tedious as I do. I still play with them because I like the mod packs that I get them in, but I find them very tedious, especially without something like Vein Miner, in which case they're even more tedious. And it turns out that humans in general also think that smashing rocks with a hammer is pretty tedious. As early as 973 CE, people stopped smashing rocks by hand and started using something called stamp mills. Stamp mills are really just bigger hammers, but automated. And yes, there are Minecraft mods for that too, but that's not going to stop me from building a stamp mill here in vanilla. This is a stamp mill. The way that it works is there's a flat surface inside the mortar box here where you put the stones. The stamp mill then gets powered somehow. The ones that I've seen, or at least the older stamp mills that I've seen, tend to be powered either by water wheels or later by steam engines. These days, this is a bit more high-tech and electrical, but we're gonna build the old-timey kind of stamp mill. When I say old-timey, we're gonna build like an 18th century kind of style of stamp mill. So there's this flat surface inside of the mortar box here, which is basically the place where you put the stones. So the stones sit on a flat surface, and then there are these big hammers of stone or metal called stamp shoes, and they are attached to a shaft. The shaft has a lip or a notch or a piece of metal called a tappet, and that's up by the wheel that you turn to power the stamp mill. The wheel turns its own shaft, called a camshaft, which then turns the cams. Now, a cam is... right, so cams are rotating or sliding parts of a machine that change rotary motion into linear motion. So here, these cams are taking the rotation of the wheel and turning it into up and down motion in the stamps. Cams can be a lot of different shapes, but a lot of the cams that I've seen for stamp mills are shaped a bit like the blades of a food processor. They're these curved pieces of metal that ease the stamp up and up and up and up, and then suddenly let it fall to crush the rock, letting gravity do most of the work. I think that this is technically a type of snail cam, which often looks like snail shells, but I'm not sure because they don't quite look the same, and I couldn't find out what the actual type of cam this was. So engineers, if there are any engineers watching, let me know if this is a snail cam or some other type of cam in the comments. So we turn the wheel, which turns the cams, which hook onto the tappets, raise them up as high as they can go, and then suddenly drop them, the shaft, and the stamp shoes onto the rocks, breaking them open and releasing the raw copper inside. After that, you basically rake the crushed rock and ore and copper and such out of the mortar box, and that then goes further along in the process, which we will talk about later with next episode, because getting through the stamp mill is where that's the point where my brain understood. And then we got to the parts of the process after crushing the ore, and that's when my brain short-circuited. So we're gonna do that next episode. Now, as I said, stamp mills were built as early as 973 CE, and that's true. But believe it or not, the invention and use of stamp mills, or vertical water mills in general, is a pretty big topic in history and archaeology, and it kinda has to do with the Enlightenment and European or Western exceptionalism. So, during the Enlightenment, a lot of things changed, but one of the bigger ones, and the one that's relevant here, was the idea that humanity is constantly progressing in a linear way, moving upwards or forwards into a generally better state. Like the principles of evolution, humanity as a whole was said to be continually progressing towards some perfect ideal. A lot of folks will say that this idea came from Hegel or Kant or Marx, and that's mostly true, though those three didn't have identical views, so be careful of lumping them all together. But those of us who have studied humanity are very aware that things like technologies ebb and flow and are very much affected by the cultures that employ them and by those that don't. This is a huge discussion by itself. It's like a major thing in archaeology and history. But what matters for stamp mills is that for a long while, people thought, and at times still think, that humanity is progressing in a single, linear way towards some type of quote-unquote goal. Since the Enlightenment was a European or Western cultural and intellectual movement, the people who had this idea of linear progression generally assumed that they were at the pinnacle of humanity's quote-unquote progression in the current age. Bluntly, if they didn't think that, they'd have to admit that other people were better than them, and generally speaking, humans don't like to do that all that much. So since the Enlightenment was a European or Western idea in the 18th to 19th centuries, that meant that according to the Enlightenment, 18th to 19th century Europe was the best humanity had ever been and had the best technology that humanity had ever had. There is so much more nuance involved in all of this, but that's basically the gist, or at least the gist of what's important for stamp mills. In 18th and 19th century Europe, many copper mines didn't use stamp mills at all, despite Agricola talking about them in his 16th century book. Instead, after spalling, workers, who were sometimes called cobbers, would break the ore into pebble-sized pieces before more workers, who were sometimes called buckers, would break it into basically a powder, and then that would get fired and turned into copper. That's also more or less how copper mining was done before stamp mill technology ever existed. But we have pretty clear evidence for stamp mills or similar technologies at least as far back as the 1st century CE. Pliny the Elder actually talks about water-powered pestles for pounding grain, and there's evidence for mechanized ore crushing during the Roman period at places like the Dolichothi gold mines in Wales, as well as other sites in the Iberian Peninsula. Interestingly, though, the evidence for stamp mills in Europe seems to peter out after the 3rd or 4th centuries, and then it reappears in Europe in the 12th century. In fact, there are 4 separate sources, 3 from the 12th century and 1 from the 13th, that talk about trip hammers or stamp mills in what is now Austria and France. Leonardo da Vinci actually sketched a few trip hammers, which work basically the same way as a stamp mill. And then there's Agricola in the 16th century showing exactly how stamp mills worked. But stamp mills, as I said, weren't widespread in 18th and 19th century Europe, and the Enlightenment argues that humanity is continually progressing, especially in technology. So the Romans, or even 12th century Europe using stamp mills when much of Europe during the Enlightenment was very clearly not using stamp mills, doesn't vibe with that idea. I also mentioned that 973 date, which comes from Samarkand, which is a city in what is now Uzbekistan but was a major hub in the medieval world. We also have evidence of stamp mills or similar technologies in medieval Persia and in much of the Islamic world from the 11th century onwards. But the Enlightenment also generally argued that European or Western cultures were the most quote-unquote progressive in their concept of linear progression of humanity. So non-European or non-Western cultures using such technologies from earlier periods than Europeans necessarily were also doesn't vibe with that idea. The reason that matters is that in academia, in terms of the history of stamp mills, that manifests in people believing that stamp mill history more or less began in the 18th and 19th centuries. And then when it was demonstrated that we had pretty clear evidence of this technology existing, a lot of arguments kind of poo-pooed that idea as, oh, well, they weren't using it for the same thing, or they weren't using it in as sophisticated a manner, so that it could still kind of pigeonhole into this idea of linear progression and European or Western exceptionalism. Now, we don't really think that way today, or at least many of us don't, but academia can take a very long time to shift away from problematic philosophies like this one, in part because there are so many academics in so many different places and getting the word out to everybody can be really difficult, but also in part because many academics are resistant to anything that might call their work into question or even invalidate much of their work. Many of us are more open to that sort of debate, and academia as a whole is getting better at that year upon year. But by and large, academic disciplines can be very resistant to change. It also helps that academics now are more globally connected than ever before, and that we have more and more perspectives that aren't just your stereotypical university professor meme. But you can imagine that it's taken us a while to try to move away from that Enlightenment idea of linear progression with Western cultures being further along than everyone else. In fact, we are still trying to move away from it. A lot of the articles that I was reading for this video were still trying to move away from it. And moving away from it means things as seemingly small as truly understanding the history of the stamp mill, which very clearly ebbs and flows. Some periods use stamp mills extensively while others lose the technology for one reason or another. It's possible that for those regions it was lost, as in like there was no one left who knew how to build the things, but it's also possible that people knew how to build the things but didn't have the influence to acquire the materials or the wealth needed to purchase them, or maybe access to specific or known materials was cut off somehow. Pencil leads today are the way they are largely because France went to war with most of Europe and they lost their source of graphite for pencils. Seriously, the main source of graphite at the time was Britain, and in a pinch you could get graphite sticks made from powdered graphite from Germany. During the French Revolutionary Wars, France was basically at war with Germany and Britain, or at the very least blockaded by them, so they couldn't import pencil leads. Pencils were a primary tool for engineering, military planning, and a whole host of other vital industries, so not having pencils was an enormous problem. Lazare Carnot, who at the time held or was about to hold the absolutely wonderful title of Director of the Directory, asked Nicolas Jacques-Conté to create pencil leads using the inferior graphite that they did have access to, and that's how modern pencil leads were created. The point is, technology isn't always a linear progression, and humanity, or at least a portion of humanity, can lose access to technology for a whole host of reasons, none of which have to do with their general ability or intelligence or lack thereof. And we can see that in the use of stamp mills in various places over time. So in this world, I've built a version of a stamp mill that you can make without iron technology, so no diamonds or redstone or anything either. And I think that this works pretty well. Minecraft really struggles with things at this scale, the 2 to 4 meters across and the 2 to 4 meters deep sort of scale, especially if it's something like a machine. We don't have much that can be like sub 1 meter scale and not take up a full block. We also struggle with smaller things, but I feel like I notice it more with the stuff like this that's like 2 to 4 meters by 2 to 4 meters. Stamp mills are large machines in real life too, but you can't get a 3-stamp stamp mill in Minecraft without each stamp taking up a full meter, which they really don't in real life. Georgius Agricola also talks about stamp mills. He goes into a lot of detail about how large they are, how big the planks are, how they're made, and then he says that at least for 16th century Germany, the cams are raised by a water wheel. Also, the style of stamp mill he describes is a front-loading stamp mill, at least from what I can tell, so the ore gets shoveled in from the front and then crushed, and then it gets raked out from the front as well. He also mentions that there's a board that can be raised or lowered in the front so that when it's lowered, it keeps the ore in the area of the stamp mill where the stamps actually are so that the ore can be crushed. And then raising up that board lets the workers shovel or rake out the crushed sand or gravel once it's finished. Agricola also says that quite a few elements of the stamp mill are made out of iron, which makes sense for 16th century Europe. They'd had iron and steel for a really long time by then. But I don't have iron technology yet in this world, and we don't really have a good copper wall option, so I went with tough instead. But also, I would imagine that copper or bronze would be rather soft materials for something like a stamp shoe, so I could see it getting warped or misshapen really quickly. Even for the iron stamp shoes, Agricola says, quote, "To prevent the stamp head from becoming broken by the constant striking of fragments of ore or rocks, there is placed around it a quadrangular iron band, a digit thick, 7 digits wide, and 6 digits deep." In any case, the copper ore gets crushed, and for a long time, it was crushed in a stamp mill like this one. And before we go, I mentioned in my last video that I'd started building houses because we've reached the point where both the copper industry and the brick industry would have at least a dozen people employed, and that's a low estimate. I also kept thinking about what Georgius Agricola said about separating the house for the windlass and the house where people sleep, and I built a larger windlass here, or really more like a crane, so there isn't really a house over the windlass, but that doesn't mean that I don't need a house where people sleep. So I built a house for the miners as well. I'm gonna be honest, when I was building this house, it had been well over a year since I built a building in this world, so I kinda just built a house without worrying too much about whether the style matched the rest of the buildings around my base. It could be that as we progress in this series, I just end up with kind of a mishmash of house styles. I don't think I will. I think it'll be more like, you know, as cities or towns build up, there are different styles of houses in different parts of the town or the city, depending on what was built first and what was built later, what was revamped, that kind of a thing. So I don't think it's gonna look totally out of place. I think we may just end up with some interesting combinations of architecture in some districts or something. Or it could be that we just end up with some random weird house in places. Like, tell me that where you live there isn't some weird house somewhere that everybody knows about. Like, there's always at least one. So don't worry too much about whether the architecture matches the architecture of the other buildings in this area. It's fine. So that's the stamp mill. We've smashed open the ores to try to get at the copper, but we don't have copper yet. The next part of the process is either consolidation or just smelting the ore. And figuring out when to use which technique was when I realized that turning copper into stuff is far more complicated than I thought, and I will admit that my brain may or may not have melted slightly. So it's not impossible for me to understand. It's just complicated enough that I'm going to end this episode here, and we'll continue with copper in the next one. That's all for me for today, everybody. Thank you all for tuning in, and I hope you have a great rest of your day. Bye!